The snow in Caribou has a way of muffling the world, of making even the crunch of my own boots on the path sound like a secret. At 78, the cold finds its way into my bones quicker than it used to, a persistent guest I can't quite turn away. But some visits are non-negotiable. I saw the car when I turned off the main road, a dark sedan, too clean, parked under the skeletal arms of a leafless birch about 200 yards from the cemetery gate. No exhaust plume in the brittle air. Just waiting. Preston's eyes, I figured. He's gotten impatient. The iron gate groaned its familiar protest as I pushed it open, the sound swallowed by the thick, snow-dusted silence of the place. My Eleanor rests here. Has for 10 years now. The path to her stone was a narrow trench in the fresh powder, a trail only I make, but as I walked, I felt the weight of another gaze on my back, a pressure as tangible as the gray sky pressing down. Kneeling is harder now. The knee pops. The cold ground seeps through the wool of my trousers. I brushed the light dusting of snow from the granite face of her marker with my glove. Eleanor Grace. Just seeing her name carved there, so permanent in this frozen earth, brings the same hollow ache. It never fills. From my coat pocket, I drew the single white rose. I'd kept it wrapped in paper in the cold trunk of my old Buick, and its petals were still tight against the stem, a shock of purity against all this white and gray. I laid it gently on the stone. He's watching, Ellie, I whispered, my breath a cloud in the stillness. The ledger's still safe. Elias is holding firm, but Preston, he's sending men to places like this now. That's when I heard it. The faint, almost inaudible click, click, click. Not a woodpecker. Not in this quiet. It was the shutter of a camera with a long lens. The investigator in the car documenting my grief, my rituals, my vulnerabilities, turning my love into a dossier for a man like Preston. A deep, tired sadness settled over me, heavier than my winter coat. It wasn't fear, it was resignation, and a profound disappointment that it had come to this, that a man couldn't even visit his wife in peace. With the final pat on the cold stone, I pushed myself up. I didn't brush the snow from my knees. Instead, I turned slowly, deliberately, my old eyes scanning the tree line. I found the car, a dark smudge in the distance, and I looked right at it, not with anger or defiance, just a sad, knowing look. A look that said, I see you, I've always seen the game, and I know exactly who sent you. I held that gaze for a long 3 seconds, letting the man behind the lens understand he was no longer hidden. Then I turned, shoved my cold hands deep into my pockets, and began the slow walk back to my car, leaving the single white rose as the only color in a monochrome world. The watching, it seemed, was now a conversation. The sound of tires on gravel was never a good sign out here. I was on the porch, whittling a piece of old birch, when I saw Preston's sleek car kick up dust down the lane. My heart, this old tired thing, sank right into my boots. He wasn't alone. My other two were with him, but it was Preston who stepped out first, his city shoes looking alien against the dirt. Dad, he said, and the word felt like an accusation. He didn't wait for an invitation, just marched up the steps, my daughter Leah and my youngest Ben, trailing behind him with worried eyes. They all stood there on my porch, a wall of my own flesh and blood, and the air turned cold. We need to talk, Preston stated, crossing his arms. That lawyer posture of his. We've been talking, all of us, and we're concerned. I just kept whittling, the curl of wood falling silently to the planks. I knew what was coming. I'd seen the looks at the funeral, felt the distance growing like weeds in a neglected field. It's been a year since Mom died, Leah said, her voice softer, but the hurt in it cut deeper. You vanished out here. You won't return calls. You're secretive. Then Preston leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. People talk, Dad. They see you out in the woods at all hours. They say you're meeting someone. Is that it? Was Mom even in the ground before you? I stopped whittling. The knife went still. I looked up, meeting each of their eyes. Leah's brimming with tears, Ben's confused and angry, Preston's blazing with certainty. The betrayal was a physical weight on my chest. They thought I was dishonoring her, the woman whose memory was the very compass of my life. My silence seemed to infuriate Preston more. Well, he demanded, do you have anything to say for yourself? Anything at all? I had 1,000 things to say. I wanted to tell them about the hollow in the world her absence left. I wanted to explain the long walks, the silence of the trees. That was the only thing that matched the silence in our house. I wanted to scream that every secret I kept was for them, to protect the fragile peace she'd wanted for our family. But the words turned to ash in my mouth. If they could believe this of me, if Preston could so easily cast me as the villain, then my explanations were worthless. My heartbreak was a private thing, a locked box they were trying to smash open with the wrong key. So I just looked back down at the wood in my hands. I took a slow, steady breath, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. I said nothing. My silence was my answer, my grief, and my shield. The only sound was the wind in the old oaks, a lonely sound, as I sat there, besieged in my own home by the children I loved more than life itself. The leather of Elias's office chair creaked as I leaned forward, the smell of old books and lemon polish hanging in the air. It had been years since I'd sat here, back when my biggest problem was a zoning dispute. Now I was about to ask my oldest friend for help with something unorthodox. "You look like a man who's about to jump off a cliff, Silas," Elias said, his voice a low, familiar rumble. He hadn't changed much, just a little more gray at the temples, a few more lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours, not laughter. "I might be," I admitted, my fingers tracing a knot in his oak desk. "I need your help, and I need you to not ask me if I've lost my mind until I'm finished explaining." He simply nodded, steepling his fingers. That was Elias. He listened first. I took a breath. Preston is going to try to destroy me. He's going to twist every good deed, every hard day, into something ugly for my kids. He'll paint me as the villain in their story. Just saying his name left a bitter taste. I can't fight whispers and lies with just my word. I need evidence, cold, hard, impartial evidence of my life. Elias's brow furrowed. "What are you proposing?" "I've hired a private investigator," I said, watching his face carefully, "to follow me, document my daily routine, my meetings, my character, everything, for the next few months. We compile it all, a report, a dossier. I'm calling it the Birchwood Ledger." The name felt solid, real as I said it. "When the time is right, I give it to my children, not as a defense, but as proof. This is who your father was. This is the truth." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Elias removed his glasses and polished them slowly on his tie, an old habit when he was thinking hard. "A PI," he repeated. "You're having yourself surveilled." "Yes." "And who is this investigator?" This was the tricky part. "It's your nephew, Marcus." Elias froze, his glasses halfway back to his face. I saw the conflict flash in his eyes, the lawyer's caution warring with the friend's concern. "Silas, that's a heavy burden to put on him, on this family. You're pulling us into your war." "I know," I said, my voice dropping, "and I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. I need someone I can trust implicitly. You trust Marcus. You trained him. He's discreet. He's ethical. And you can act as the intermediary. All the reports come to you. You hold the ledger. You're the keeper of the record." He leaned back, the chair groaning again, and stared at the ceiling. A full minute passed. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on his bookshelf, counting the seconds. Finally, he looked at me, his gaze steady but weary. "This is a radical plan, my friend. Dangerous. If Preston found out..." "He can't. That's why it has to be you and Marcus." Elias let out a long, slow sigh. It was the sound of surrender, but not defeat. It was the sound of a man deciding to stand in the trench beside you. "All right," he said, the word heavy with consequence. "I'll talk to Marcus. I'll facilitate this. But Silas, for your sake and for theirs, I hope this ledger is a gift of clarity and not a weapon that blows up in your hands." The relief that washed over me was so profound it felt like weakness. "Thank you, Elias." He just nodded, already looking like a man burdened with a secret. The Birchwood Ledger was no longer just an idea in my head. It was now a promise in this quiet, book-lined room. And the first page had just been written. The envelope felt heavier than it should have every time Elias slid it across the table to me. For weeks, this had been our secret ritual. I'd meet him at the back booth of the diner, the one with the cracked vinyl seat, and he'd hand over the latest surveillance report on Silas. "He went to the hardware store again," Elias would mutter, not meeting my eyes. "Bought more epoxy resin and a new tarp." I'd scan the typed pages, my mind racing. A tarp? What was he building? Or more likely burying? But it was the other detail, the one that appeared every single day, that truly gnawed at me. The cemetery. Silas visited the Caribou Municipal Cemetery every afternoon without fail. Elias shifted uncomfortably as I read the latest entry aloud, in a low whisper. Subject spent 47 minutes at plot 14B, appeared to be in conversation with the headstone. Conversation? I scoffed, folding the paper. He's not talking to the dead, Elias. He's using it as a drop point. A cover. He's meeting someone there. My ally looked skeptical, stirring his cold coffee. Preston, it's a small town. Everyone knows his wife is buried there. Maybe he's just grieving. That's exactly what he wants you to think. I leaned in, my voice dropping. Think about it. A public place but private, secluded. No one questions a man at his wife's grave. It's the perfect blind for exchange. He's not mourning, he's orchestrating. He has the ledger, and he's trying to move it, or sell the information piece by piece. The pieces fit together too neatly in my head. The hardware store runs were for supplies to hide or transport the ledger. The long walks in the woods were likely to scout remote locations. But the cemetery, that was the operational heart of it, a secret liaison. Someone was helping him, meeting him right under the nose of the whole town, using the sacred ground of a graveyard as their covert meeting room. Every new report from Elias, delivered with increasing unease, tightened the coil in my stomach. My suspicion hardened into certainty. Silas wasn't a heartbroken widower. He was a calculated opponent, using his own tragedy as the ultimate smokescreen. And I was the only one who could see it. I paid for Elias's coffee, a silent payment for his continued silence, and left the diner. The sun was high, but I felt a chill. Somewhere across town, Silas was probably on his way to the cemetery right now, for his daily visit. But I knew the truth. The game was in motion, and he was making his move. I just had to wait for the report that would finally catch him in the act. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the weight of old secrets. I, Preston, stood surrounded by the ghosts of my family, not the literal kind buried in Birchwood Cemetery, but the paper ones stuffed in trunks and boxes. My father's recent secretive trips to the graveyard had nothing to do with tending a plot. I was sure of it. He was meeting someone, a lover, hiding her grief, or their affair, behind a veil of mourning. My investigation started where any sensible one would, the cemetery office. Old Mr. Harlow, the keeper of records, peered at me over his spectacles as I spun a clumsy lie about a school genealogy project. My hands were clammy as I flipped through the heavy ledger of plot purchases and internments. The Bell family names stared back at me. Grandparents, a great-aunt I never knew. But no new purchases, no unfamiliar names linked to ours. Nothing. Just rows of neat, useless ink. The frustration was a slow burn in my chest. If she wasn't buried there, who was he visiting? Which meant the clue wasn't in who was in the ground, but in who might be above it. So I turned my sights home, to the one person who might have seen arrival first, my mother. She's been gone 5 years now, but her presence is still tucked into every corner of this house, especially up here. I dragged her old cedar hope chest from the shadowed eaves, the latch groaning in protest. Inside I found not answers, but a haunting. Bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, all in my father's firm, younger hand, addressed to her during their courtship. Photographs of them smiling, arms linked, before the weight of our family name settled on their shoulders. I sifted through birthday cards I'd made as a child, pressed flowers, the fragile archaeology of a happy marriage. But there was no hidden journal, no suspicious photograph of a mysterious woman, no angry, scribbled note hinting at betrayal. Just love. Simple, documented, profound love. It felt like a violation to look through it, and yet I kept digging, growing more frantic. The dust coated my throat. Every cherished memento I unearthed felt like it was accusing me. My theory, which had felt so solid, so obvious, began to crumble like the dried petals falling from an old corsage. Where was the evidence? If my father was having an affair, my mother, sharp-eyed and perceptive, would have known. She would have left a trace of that pain here among her most private things. But there was none. I sat back on the rough floorboards, surrounded by the open chest and scattered papers, the silence of the attic pressing in. The frustration wasn't just mounting anymore. It had solidified into a cold, hard knot of confusion. I had been so certain, but the ledger showed nothing, and my mother's archives whispered only of a love that seemed, at least on the surface, untarnished. I had hit a dead end, and the only thing buried here was my own certainty. The air in the cemetery was cold, the kind that seeps into your bones. I'd come to visit Mom, to try and find some quiet, some connection. I should have known better, I heard his footsteps on the gravel path before I saw him. Preston. He didn't walk, he marched. A storm cloud in a tailored coat, his face a mask of pure contempt. In his hand was a manila envelope. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," he spat, his voice cutting through the quiet. He stopped a few feet from me, right beside our mother's headstone. A couple of people tending a plot a few rows over paused, glancing our way. My heart sank. "Preston, not here. Not today." "Where better," he hissed, his voice rising. He ripped the envelope open and fanned out a stack of glossy photographs. I saw grainy shots of me leaving the county clerk's office, of me talking with Elias outside the library. "You've been digging, snooping. After everything she did for you, you're trying to tarnish her memory, to dishonor her?" The word dishonor hit me like a physical blow. I could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on us, a silent, awful audience to our family's collapse. "It's not like that," I said, my own voice trembling. "You don't understand what I found." "I understand perfectly," he shouted, waving the photos. "I have the private investigator's reports, Silas. All of them. It's a fantasy, a sick attempt to rewrite history because you could never measure up to her expectations when she was alive." Each word was a knife. The old wound, the feeling of never being enough for her, yawned open. But beneath the hurt, a cold, solid anger took root. He had the reports. He had all the same pieces I did. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak above us. I looked from my brother's furious face to our mother's name, carved in stone. The truth was right there, buried in the details he was too angry, too proud to see. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a devastating, weary certainty. I met his eyes, my voice dropping to a near whisper, meant for him but carrying in the still air. "You have all the reports, Preston," I said, the words feeling final. "Look closer." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his photos and his fury, the silent stones of the cemetery, bearing witness to the chasm that had just cracked wide open between us. The air in Elias's office was thick with a silence I'd never heard before. It wasn't angry, it was stunned. I stood by the window, my back to the room, listening to the rustle of paper and the slow, heavy breaths of my family. Preston was here, of course, seated right in the center, his usual smug certainty replaced by a wary tension. Elias cleared his throat. "Everyone, please, sit. We're not leaving until we've all looked at this." I turned around. On his wide, polished desk sat a single thick binder. It was plain dark leather, but Elias had placed a small, handwritten label on the front, the Birchwood Ledger. "This," Elias said, his voice calm but firm, placing a hand on the binder, "is the final report. Every photograph, every time-stamped log, every financial trail our investigator compiled. It's all here, unedited." Preston scoffed, but it was weak. More of Silas's paranoid fiction. "No," Elias said, cutting him off. He looked directly at me, then back at the family. "This wasn't paranoia. This was a message, one we were all too furious, too hurt, to even consider hearing." He opened the ledger, the spine cracking softly. "Silas didn't hire that PI to spy on us. He orchestrated the entire surveillance operation to document a truth that was being systematically hidden from us. The leak, the skewed contracts, the diverted funds, it's all mapped here, leading back to one source." He let the words hang. All eyes drifted from the damning pages to Preston, whose face had drained of color. "The trap," I finally spoke, my voice quiet in the hushed room, "was never for you. Not really. It was for this moment. The plan was to let the evidence be gathered completely until it was undeniable, and then to place it here, in this neutral space, and ask you all to judge it, not based on my accusations or your anger at me for seeming like a traitor, but based on this." I gestured to the ledger. To read it without prejudice, to see what I saw coming, and what I was trying, clumsily, desperately, to stop. I saw my aunt's hand tremble as she reached for a page. My cousin, who'd refused to speak to me for weeks, was staring at a series of bank transfers, his eyes wide. Elias closed the binder. The trap was for the truth. We were the ones who had to walk into it willingly, with open eyes. Silas just built the door. The room stayed silent, but the silence had changed again. The shock was melting, replaced by a dawning, horrible clarity. The ledger sat between us, no longer just a file, but a witness. And for the first time, everyone was finally listening to what it had to say. The air in the town hall was thick enough to choke on. I stood beside Elias, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape the coming wreckage. Across the room, Preston wore a smirk of pure triumph, surrounded by our neighbors, all of whom he'd poisoned against me. He thought this was his victory lap. "Go ahead, Elias," Preston's voice cut through the murmur, oily with false sympathy. "Read it. Let everyone hear the proof of Silas's treachery. The secret meetings, the hidden object, all of it." Elias, my steady rock, gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't open the folder of lies Preston had prepared. Instead, he lifted the worn, leather-bound Birchwood Ledger. A confused ripple went through the crowd. Preston's smirk faltered, just for a second. "You're right, Preston," Elias began, his voice clear and calm. "This ledger does detail secretive movements, daily visits to a specific location outside of town, carrying a concealed object, receiving private, scheduled calls." He opened the book, his finger tracing the elegant old script. "But the reports never, not once, mention another person." The room fell utterly silent. Preston leaned forward, his confidence starting to look brittle. "What are you talking about?" "The location," Elias continued, locking eyes with him, "is Plot 17, Row 9, in the Willow Creek Cemetery. The daily visit was to the grave of Eleanor Birchwood. The name of our mother, spoken aloud in that room after so many years, hit me with a physical force. I had to brace a hand on the table. The mysterious object he carried was a single white rose. The secret calls were to Mrs. Henderson at the florist's garden, to ensure one was always fresh and waiting for him. I could feel every eye on me now, but the judgment was gone, replaced by a dawning, awful understanding. The secret I'd kept so close, the grief I wore like a second skin, was laid bare. It wasn't betrayal, it was love. A son's enduring, quiet love for a mother he lost too young, a ritual of remembrance so private I couldn't even share it with my own brother. "His secret," Elias said, his own voice thickening as he looked at me, full of an apology I could see he'd carried for weeks, "wasn't greed or deception. It was profound grief and enduring love." I finally looked at Preston. The smirk was gone. His face, usually so composed and cunning, had completely shattered. It wasn't anger I saw there, but a hollow, devastating realization. He hadn't uncovered a villain. He'd weaponized a man's heartbreak. He'd turned my most sacred, quiet act of love into a public crime. And in the glaring light of the truth, his entire house of cards, his accusations, his manipulations, collapsed into nothing but dust and shame. He didn't say a word. He just stared. The architect of his own utter ruin, surrounded by the silence he'd meant for me. The silence in the old study was absolute, heavier than the dust on the shelves. I held the Birchwood Ledger, its pages open to the truth, and watched Preston's face. For a moment, it was just the arrogant mask I'd known for years, the man who had built a wall of suspicion, brick by brick. Then it began to crack. It started in his eyes. That unwavering, judgmental glare just dissolved. He wasn't looking at me or at Elias, who stood quietly by my side. He was staring through the ledger, through the floor, into some private abyss of his own making. His shoulders, always held so rigidly high, slumped as if the very bones had turned to sand. He trusted me," Preston whispered, the words barely audible. "All those years, he was trying to protect her memory, and I called it guilt." His voice broke on the last word. The great Preston, the self-appointed prosecutor of our family's past, brought to his knees not by a shout, but by a whisper of his own conscience. A ragged sob tore from his throat, and he pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "I'm sorry." The apology was muffled, wet with tears. He wasn't just saying it to the air. He looked at me, then at Elias, his face a map of raw shame. "I'm so sorry. I was so sure. I needed someone to blame, and I chose the easiest target. I didn't have faith in him. I didn't have faith in anything but my own anger." That's when I saw the others, our cousins, who had stood with him, nodding along to every accusation. You could see it dawning on them, a slow, sickening realization. Their faces weren't triumphant anymore. They were pale, their eyes wide with the dawning horror. They hadn't just followed Preston, they had empowered him. Their whispers had become his evidence, their shared suspicion a poison they'd all helped to brew. One of them, Sarah, the youngest, had tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand over her mouth as if to stop a cry. The false narrative, the story we'd all lived with for a decade, that our grandfather was a man consumed by a dark secret, lay in pieces on the floor between us. It was destroyed not by a dramatic fight, but by the quiet, devastating weight of a simple, loving truth recorded in faded ink. The ledger hadn't exposed a villain. It had exposed our own willingness to believe in one. Preston was still crying, his body curled in on itself. The villain wasn't defeated in a clash of wills. He was destroyed by the reflection of his own arrogance, and the heartbreaking sight of a son realizing he had failed to trust his own father. The room held its breath, the only sound the soft, broken weeping of a man finally meeting the truth, and finding it was himself he should have accused all along. The air in the cemetery was still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and sacred. Weeks had passed since the fire, since the truth of the Birchwood Ledger had scorched our family's foundations clean. I stood before Eleanor's headstone, the granite cool and familiar under my fingertips. But for the first time, I was not alone here. Preston stood beside me. Not the villain I had hunted, but a man hollowed out by grief and guilt. The sharp, cruel angles of his face had softened into something weary and sad. In his hands he held a single white rose, its petals flawless against the dark wool of his coat. We didn't speak. What was there to say that the ledger hadn't already screamed in its pages? He had loved her too. In his own twisted, desperate way, my brother had loved my wife. His jealousy wasn't born of hatred for me, but of a love for her he could never rightly express, a love that festered in the dark until it poisoned everything. Seeing him now stripped of his power and his lies, I didn't see the arsonist or the thief. I just saw my little brother, lost at our mother's grave all those years ago, and never truly finding his way home. He glanced at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave a single, slow nod. Together we stepped forward. He knelt, the damp earth staining his knees, and I crouched beside him. His hands, the ones that had lit the match, were trembling. He placed the rose gently at the base of the stone, right where I always left my flowers. "I'm so sorry, Ellie," he whispered, his voice breaking on the old nickname. It was the first time I'd heard him say her name in years without a sneer. A peace settled over me then, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak sun. It was the final piece sliding into place. My love for Eleanor had never been the secret. It had been the one true, bright thing. Preston's actions had tried to bury it, to twist it into something shameful, but the ledger had only proven how boundless it was. She had loved me, she had chosen me. All his scheming couldn't change that history. It could only make the truth of it hurt more when it finally broke free. We stood up together. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the rose. The villain was gone, leaving only a remorseful son, a broken brother. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once burned, grows back slowly, like new grass over scorched earth. But Elias was already talking to him again, cautious, short conversations that were a beginning. Our family was cracked, but it was no longer bleeding. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, then relaxed, a shuddering breath leaving him. We turned and walked out of the cemetery side by side, not as hero and villain, but as two men carrying the same weight, finally heading toward the same light. The ledger was ashes. My heart, for the first time in years, was full.